Close your eyes, if you are willing, and let your body settle into whatever surface holds you now. The soft weight of a pillow, the familiar warmth of a blanket, drawn just so against the cool of the night. And breathe slowly, with no urgency at all, for there is nowhere you need to be, nothing you need to do. And the world outside this moment is very far away indeed. Let the tension in your shoulders release. Gently, like candle wax softening in the warmth of a quiet room, and let your thoughts slow, one by one, like leaves drifting down through still autumn air, settling without sound onto still water. Tonight we are going to travel together, you and I, backward through time, backward through the decades, backward through the turning of centuries, to a world that stood on the edge of something it did not yet understand. A world that had just discovered a new kind of light, a light that came not from fire, not from the sun, but from the earth itself, from stones and ores and minerals buried in the dark for millions of years, radiating a quiet, persistent glow. We are going to follow that light, softly and slowly, through laboratories and spas, and factory floors and courtrooms. And we are going to let that history wash over us like warm water, like the distant sound of rain on a rooftop, like the soft turning of pages in a library that no one else is using tonight. If this voice helps you rest a little easier in the dark, consider subscribing to Plague Lullaby. But only, of course, if you are still awake, and if you are, do not worry, for the story is long, and the night is longer, and there is no need to rush toward any ending at all. It begins, as so many things in science begin, not with a grand announcement, but with an accident, a quiet, almost mundane accident in a Paris laboratory in the winter of 1896, when a French physicist named Henri Becquerel was conducting experiments with phosphorescent minerals and a set of photographic plates wrapped carefully in black paper, and the sky outside his laboratory window was overcast on the 26th of February, grey and diffuse, and entirely unhelpful to his research, which required sunlight to activate the fluorescent compounds he was studying, and so he placed the uranium salts and the wrapped photographic plates together in a drawer and intended to wait for clearer weather to continue his work. He did not have to wait long, though perhaps not for the reason he expected, because when he returned to the drawer on the 1st of March and developed those photographic plates, not because he thought anything particularly interesting had happened, but simply out of curiosity, he found that the plates had been exposed, darkened, marked by something that had passed through the black paper in the total absence of sunlight, in the complete darkness of a closed drawer, without any stimulation whatsoever from the world outside. He reported this finding the very next day, on the 2nd of March, 1896, to the French Academy of Sciences, noting that the uranium salts had emitted some form of penetrating radiations entirely on their own, spontaneously, without any input of energy from outside themselves. And in doing so, Henri Becquerel, perhaps without fully understanding the weight of what he had found, opened a door into a new territory of physics that no map had yet described, and no compass had yet been designed to navigate. The radiation he had discovered was not X-ray radiation, as would become clear through further experiments. For when Becquerel placed his uranium samples near a magnetic field, the emitted rays bent and curved in a way that X-rays did not, suggesting something charged and fundamentally different was at work within the uranium, something that came not from external energy sources, but from within the atom itself, a phenomenon for which the world did not yet have a word, and would not have one for several more years, until a young woman working in a poorly ventilated shed in Paris would give it the name by which we know it today. Becquerel would later share the Nobel Prize in Physics in 1903 in recognition of this discovery, described formally as his extraordinary services in the discovery of spontaneous radioactivity. And he would share that prize, fittingly and poetically, with the very woman whose work had expanded his accidental finding into one of the defining scientific revolutions of the 20th century, and her name was Marie Curie. And her story begins not in Paris but in Warsaw, in a cold autumn, in the year 1867. Maria Sklodowska was born on the 7th of November 1867 in Warsaw, then under the control of the Russian Empire, in a city where the Polish language was suppressed in schools, and the pursuit of advanced education by women was not merely discouraged, but formally prohibited. And yet she was, from a very early age, a person of remarkable intellectual tenacity, quiet and methodical, and possessed of a memory that seemed to retain everything it encountered, which was not always a comfort in a childhood marked by poverty and loss. For her mother died when Maria was only 10 years old, and the family's financial circumstances were precarious in the way that so many scholarly families of that era experienced, rich in books and poor in almost everything else. She studied in secret, attending what was called the Flying University, a clandestine network of Polish scholars who met in private homes to offer lectures and instructions that the Russian authorities had banned from official institutions, moving from apartment to apartment, classroom to improvised classroom, carrying their knowledge like contraband, which in a very real sense it was. And it is worth noting that this early experience of learning, pursued against resistance, of science practiced in defiance of prohibition, would characterize much of what Marie Curie would do for the rest of her extraordinary life. She arrived in Paris in November of 1891, at the age of 24, having scraped together enough money and opportunity to enroll at the Sorbonne, where she was one of only a handful of women among hundreds of male students, and she lived in an unheated attic room and ate almost nothing, and studied with a concentration so fierce that her professors could not help but notice her, and by 1893 she had earned her degree in physics, and by 1894 her degree in mathematics, achievements that would have been remarkable for anyone, and were, under the circumstances, something close to extraordinary. It was through a mutual acquaintance in the spring of 1894 that she was introduced to Pierre Curie, a physicist of some renown who had already made significant contributions to the study of crystallography and magnetism. A tall, gentle, somewhat absent-minded man with a deep interest in the metaphysical dimensions of science, and their courtship was slow and intellectual, and conducted largely through letters and long walks, the kind of courtship that belongs to the late 19th century, measured and careful and full of shared purpose, and they were married on the 26th of July, 1895, in a quiet civil ceremony with no religious component, for they were both skeptics in the deepest and most comfortable sense of the word. It was in 1897 that Marie Curie chose the radioactive properties of uranium as the subject of her doctoral thesis, a decision that placed her at the very frontier of a new and barely charted scientific territory, for Becquerel's discovery of the previous year had attracted relatively little sustained attention from the broader scientific community, which was still dazzled by the more immediately practical wonders of X-rays, discovered by Wilhelm Röntgen in 1895, and the question of why uranium emitted radiation had been noted and largely set aside as a curious anomaly rather than a fundamental phenomenon demanding explanation. She began her investigations using an instrument called the electrometer, a device invented by Pierre and his brother Jacques to measure extremely small electrical charges. And what she found as she worked through sample after sample was that the intensity of the radiation emitted by a uranium compound was always proportional to the amount of uranium it contained, regardless of the compound's chemical form, which told her something critically important, something that would reorient the entire framework through which scientists understood the atom. The radiation was not a chemical phenomenon, not a product of how atoms were arranged in relation to one another, but a property of the uranium atom itself, of something happening deep inside it, in a place that chemistry alone could not describe or reach. She coined the word radioactivity to describe this phenomenon, a word she invented because she needed one. Because the thing she had found had no name yet in any language, and the word she chose was precise and elegant, and has passed unchanged into every major language in the world in the century and a quarter since she first wrote it down. When she turned her attention to pitch blender, the uranium-bearing mineral ore that had been mined for centuries from deposits in Bohemia, in the region then called Joachimsthal, she discovered something that should not, by the prevailing logic of the day, have been possible. The pitch blendy was significantly more radioactive than the pure uranium it contained, which meant that something else was present in the ore, something even more radioactive than uranium itself, something that had never been identified or named or measured, hiding in the mineral residue like a whisper inside a thunderstorm. She told Pierre what she had found, and Pierre set aside his own research entirely to join her, because he understood immediately that she had found something that mattered very much, and together they began the long, painstaking, physically demanding work of separating out from tons of raw pitch blend the tiny traces of two new elements that were hiding inside it, working in an old shed near the Rue Lomond that was, as Pierre wrote in his notes, rather uncomfortable, poorly lit, draughty in the cold months, and stifling in the warm ones, the floor unpaved, the roof leaking when it rained. Over the next several years, from 1897 through into 1902, the Curies processed enormous quantities of pitchblende, measuring the radioactivity of each separated fraction with meticulous precision, following the radioactivity like a trail of breadcrumbs through a dark forest, separating and reseparating and measuring again until the fractions became smaller and the radioactivity more concentrated and the presence of the new elements more unmistakable. And in July of 1898, they announced the discovery of the first of these elements, which Marie named polonium, after the country of her birth, a country that did not yet exist on any official map, but that she had never stopped carrying inside herself. And this naming was a quiet political act as well as a scientific one, a claim staked in the language of chemistry for a nation the world had not yet agreed to recognize. Then, in December of 1898, on the 26th of that month, they announced the second element, the one that had been even harder to isolate, the one whose radioactivity was so intense that it outshone everything around it in the ore, and they named this one radium, from the Latin word for ray, because what it did above all else was radiate, ceaselessly and brilliantly, and without any apparent diminishment over time. And when they finally purified a small but measurable quantity of radium chloride in March of 1902, after processing roughly 10 tons of raw pitchblende to obtain approximately 100 milligrams of the pure compound, they had done something that had never been done before in the history of science, which was to hold in their hands, in their bare, chemically burned, radiation-damaged hands, a new element, glowing faintly blue-green in the darkness of their laboratory, beautiful and dangerous, and entirely unlike anything the world had previously imagined. Marie described in her notebooks the experience of visiting the shed at night. After the day's work was done, and seeing the little glowing phials of radium arranged on the shelves in the dark, each one a soft, cold light, and she wrote that the sight was always lovely and stirring to me, and one feels it like an enchantment. And it is worth noting that the sensation she described as enchantment was in fact the visible glow of Cherenkov radiation and radioluminescence, the literal light of atoms decaying, of matter unmaking itself at the subatomic level, beautiful and devastating in equal measure. The Nobel Prize in Physics arrived in 1903, shared between Henri Becquerel and the Curie partnership, and then, in 1911, a second Nobel Prize, this time in chemistry, was awarded to Marie Curie alone, for the isolation of radium and the determination of its atomic weight, making her the first person in history to receive the prize in two separate scientific disciplines, a distinction she holds still and likely will hold for a very long time to come. Meanwhile, as the Curies worked in their cold Parisian shed, surrounded by the soft blue luminescence of radium and the constant quiet hum of their electrometer, the rest of the world was becoming aware that something extraordinary had been found, and the awareness spread not only through scientific journals and academic conferences, but through newspapers and popular magazines, and the conversations of ordinary people who had heard that a Polish woman in Paris had discovered a substance that glowed in the dark, that radiated energy from within itself, that seemed almost alive, in the way that only mysterious things can seem alive before their mystery is understood. And the public fascination with radium was immediate and widespread and deeply emotional, in a way that purely scientific discoveries rarely achieve with a general audience, because radium seemed to touch something older and more instinctive than mere scientific curiosity, something that had to do with the ancient human yearning for light in the darkness, for vitality and renewal, for substances that could transform the body and extend life, and push back against the quiet inevitability of decay. Newspapers in France and Britain and the United States carried breathless accounts of the Curie's discovery throughout 1898 and 1899, describing radium in terms that borrowed freely from the vocabularies of miracle and mysticism, calling it a wonder substance, a mysterious force of nature, a substance that released energy with no apparent source. And while scientists cautioned that the properties of radium were strange and not fully understood, those cautions were largely lost beneath the more exciting narrative of a substance that seemed to defy the known laws of physics and radiate light from within the darkness of its own atomic structure. The timing was not incidental, for the late 19th and early 20th century was a period of extraordinary scientific transformation, during which electricity had remade the cityscape. X-rays had made the invisible visible, and the telephone had collapsed the distances between human voices. And in this atmosphere of rapidly accelerating technological wonder, the public had developed a strong and entirely understandable habit of believing that the newest scientific discovery would transform daily life in ways that could not yet be fully predicted or described. And radium, with its inexplicable luminescence and its association with the elegant and brilliant Madame Curie, fit this template of transformative discovery almost perfectly, and the consequences of this fit would unfold slowly over the next 3 decades, in ways that no one in that early, hopeful period could quite have imagined. It is worth pausing here, at the turn of the 20th century, with the glow of radium still new in the world, to consider what the medical understanding of radioactivity was at this particular moment, because the story of what came next, the story of radium's long career as a purveyor of false hope and genuine harm, cannot be fully understood without understanding just how thin and uncertain the scientific understanding of radiation's effects on living tissue was in those first years after Becquerel's discovery, and how plausible, given that uncertainty, the idea of radium as a healing substance must have seemed to the doctors and scientists and ordinary people who encountered it in the early 1900s. The early indications were, paradoxically, not entirely discouraging, because among the first observed medical applications of radiation was the discovery that X-rays and subsequently radium placed in proximity to certain cancerous tumors could cause those tumors to shrink and sometimes to disappear entirely, a finding that was genuinely significant and that has formed the basis of radiation oncology, a legitimate and still practiced branch of medicine that saves lives to this day, and the logical error that would prove so costly over the following decades was the extrapolation from this genuinely useful observation to the much broader and entirely unfounded claim that radioactivity in general, consumed or applied or bathed in, was beneficial to human health in a wide variety of conditions. The concept of vitalism, the philosophical idea that living organisms are distinguished from non-living matter by some essential vital force or energy, was still widely influential in early 20th century medical thinking, and radium's apparent spontaneous emission of energy made it seem, to those who held vitalist views, like a concentrated form of this life force, a substance so charged with internal energy that mere proximity to it might restore and reinvigorate the flagging energies of the human body in the way that one might warm oneself at a fire or drink from a cold, clear spring, and this was a framework that made a kind of intuitive sense, even to educated people who might have known better, because the medical sciences were young, and the mechanisms of disease and health were still incompletely understood, and the idea that a mysterious glowing element might have healing properties was not obviously more absurd than many other ideas that legitimate medicine was entertaining at the time. Marie Curie himself, in the early years of their research, noted that when radium was applied to the skin, it produced effects similar to a burn, that the skin reddened and then blistered, and that the damage was slow to heal. And while he understood this as evidence that radium had powerful effects on living tissue, the conclusion he and others drew from this in the first instance was not that radium was dangerous to consume, but rather that its powerful effects on tissue might be medically useful, directed against tumors and diseased tissue with appropriate precision, and it would take years of mounting evidence and mounting casualties before the medical and regulatory communities would reach the much grimmer conclusion that radium's effects on living tissue were not selective between healthy and diseased cells, but were indiscriminate and cumulative and ultimately fatal. The first organized effort to transform radium's mysterious properties into commercial health applications did not emerge from the medical establishment, but from the world of spa culture, which in the early 20th century was already a well-established and highly profitable industry catering to the wealthy and the health-conscious and the perpetually anxious middle classes of Europe and North America, who had for generations been traveling to mineral springs and thermal baths in the belief that the chemical properties of natural waters could cure or alleviate a wide range of ailments, from gout to melancholy, to disorders of the digestive system and who were therefore already predisposed to believe that special waters with special properties had special healing powers. The town of Joachimsthal in Bohemia, now known as Jakimov in the Czech Republic, occupied a particular and significant position in this story because it was from the silver mines of Joachimsthal that much of the pitchblende used by the Curies in their isolation of radium had been obtained, and the region's natural hot springs happened to contain measurable quantities of radon, the radioactive gas produced by the decay of radium, and this geological accident made Joachimsthal the epicenters of what would become known as radiobalneology, the practice of bathing in and drinking radioactive spring water for therapeutic purposes. The Hotel Radium Palace was built in Joachimsthal in 1912, replacing a smaller spa that had been operating there since the early 1900s, and it offered guests the opportunity to soak in naturally radioactive waters, to inhale radon through tubes directly inserted in the nostrils, and to drink measured quantities of water drawn from the radioactive springs, all under the supervision of attending physicians, who genuinely believed, in many cases, that they were offering their patients a scientifically grounded form of treatment, and who pointed to the early cancer studies as evidence that radioactivity had medically meaningful effects on diseased tissue. Marie Curie herself visited Joachimsthal in 1925, when the spa industry there had reached the peak of its popularity and had become a destination for medical mass tourism from across Europe and beyond, and her presence in the town, warmly received and extensively reported in the newspapers of the day, gave the radioactive spa industry a patina of scientific legitimacy that its promoters exploited enthusiastically for years afterward. And it is deeply sorrowful to consider that the woman whose work had made these spas possible was herself, during this very period, suffering from the cumulative effects of decades of radiation exposure, her health quietly and invisibly failing in ways that neither she nor her physicians fully understood. Across the Atlantic Ocean, the radium health craze was taking a somewhat different, and in some respects more extravagant form, driven by the particular character of American consumer culture. In the early decades of the 20th century, which had a remarkable capacity for transforming scientific novelty into commercial product with a speed and enthusiasm that European markets rarely matched, and which operated in a regulatory environment that was, at the time, almost entirely without the kind of institutional oversight that might have slowed the more reckless applications of the new radium enthusiasm. The patent medicine industry in the United States was, in the early 1900s, a sprawling and largely unregulated marketplace in which manufacturers could make almost any claim they chose about the curative properties of their products with very little risk of legal consequence. And the passage of the Pure Food and Drug Act in 1906 had imposed some minimal requirements around honest labeling, but had done almost nothing to restrict the claims that manufacturers could make about therapeutic efficacy. And into this permissive commercial environment, radium arrived like a kind of dream ingredient, exotic and scientific, and endorsed by the most famous woman scientist in the world, and manufacturers rushed to incorporate it, or to claim to incorporate it, into an astonishing range of consumer products. There were radium-infused face creams, and radium toothpastes, and radium chocolate, and radium water, and radium butter, and radium suppositories, and radium-impregnated pads designed to be worn against the body while sleeping. And while many of these products contained no actual radium at all, because radium was extraordinarily expensive. Some of them did contain genuine quantities of the element, and those that did were perhaps more dangerous than the fraudulent versions. Though the fraudulent versions were ethically objectionable in their own particular way, promising customers a substance they were not receiving and taking money under false pretenses in the confident knowledge that no agency had the power or the inclination to stop them. One product in particular, a cream called Thoradia, became famous in France during this period for its advertising, which featured the name of a doctor, Alfred Curie, prominently displayed in a font designed to evoke the name of Pierre and Marie Curie. Though Alfred Curie had no connection whatsoever to the Nobel laureates, and the similarity of the name was entirely deliberate and entirely calculated to mislead consumers into believing they were purchasing a product endorsed by, or perhaps even formulated by, the most famous researchers in the field of radioactivity, which was a deception so audacious that one almost has to admire the sheer confidence of it, considered at this distance of time and without the knowledge of what these products were actually doing to the people who used them. It was in this environment of radium enthusiasm and commercial opportunism that a man named William John Aloysius Bailey founded, sometime around 1918, a company called the Bailey Radium Laboratories in East Orange, New Jersey, and began manufacturing what would become the most famous and the most devastating of all the radium health tonics, a product he called Radithor, which was sold in small half-ounce glass bottles and described on the label with a confidence bordering on the theatrical as a certified solution containing not less than 1 microcurie each of radium-226 and radium-228, distilled water bearing the trace of a substance that Bailey marketed under the slogans "A Cure for the Living Dead" and "Perpetual Sunshine," language that in retrospect reads as darkly prophetic in ways that no amount of ironic distance can entirely soften. Bailey himself was not a medical doctor, a fact he was careful not to emphasize in his promotional materials, having briefly attended Harvard College before dropping out. And he had a previous history in the patent medicine business that suggested a certain comfort with the flexible relationship between product description and product reality. But Radithor was unusual among the radioactive patent medicines of the era, in that it actually contained what it claimed to contain: genuine radium in genuine quantities, dissolved in genuine distilled water. And this honesty, such as it was, made it significantly more dangerous than the many fraudulent competitors whose bottles contained nothing more radioactive than ordinary tap water. Between 1925 and 1930, Bailey's Radithor was sold approximately 400,000 bottles at a price of approximately $5 per bottle, which in the currency of that era represented a substantial sum, making Radithor a product consumed primarily by wealthy Americans who could afford its price and who were drawn to its combination of scientific prestige, medical promise, and the particular social cachet that attached, in that period, to the consumption of a substance so novel and so expensive. And it was among this demographic that Radithor found its most famous and most tragic customer, a man whose name would eventually appear in headlines across the country, and whose deeply sorrowful fate would do more to end the radium health craze than any piece of legislation or any medical journal article could have accomplished alone. Eben McBurney Byers was, by any reasonable measure, a man who had everything, in the early 1920s at least, before radium entered his life, and quietly, methodically, over the course of several years, took everything away from him. He was born in 1880 in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, into a wealthy family, the son of Alexander Byers, a successful iron and steel manufacturer, and he had been educated at Yale, where he had been a prominent figure in campus social life and an enthusiastic amateur athlete. And after graduating, he had pursued the life of a well-connected American socialite, traveling, playing golf with a genuine skill that earned him the United States Amateur Golf Championship in 1906, attending the parties and weekends and country house gatherings that structured the social world of wealthy Americans in the Edwardian period, and presenting to the world a face of health and vitality and uncomplicated prosperity that seemed almost designed to illustrate a particular American ideal of the good life, vigorous and affluent, and entirely free of the kinds of shadow that had no place in the narrative such a man was expected to inhabit. He encountered Radium in 1927, following a fall he sustained on a train from a Harvard-Yale football game, an injury to his arm that caused him persistent discomfort and that he treated on the recommendation, historians suggest, of a physician of his acquaintance. With Radium, consuming it initially in modest quantities, but finding in it, or believing he found in it, a sensation of warmth and energy and renewed vitality that encouraged him to continue, and then to increase his consumption until he was drinking 2 or 3 bottles each day, a routine he maintained for approximately 3 years, from 1927 until sometime in late 1930 or early 1931, by which time his body had absorbed what later analyses would estimate at roughly 4 times the lethal dose of radium, a quantity so far beyond anything his tissues could accommodate, that the damage being done was total and irreversible, and advancing with a slow, quiet, unstoppable certainty. He had consumed, in total, approximately 1,400 bottles of Radium by the time his physician advised him to stop, and the glow of radium that he had purchased in all those small glass bottles was by then not merely passing through his body, but lodging in it, because radium, being chemically similar to calcium, is taken up by the bones as if it were a mineral the body needs, incorporated into the skeleton where it remains, irradiating the surrounding tissue from within. Year after year, for decades and even centuries, given radium's half-life of 1,600 years, and Eben Byers' skeleton was, by the early 1930s, quietly destroying itself from the inside, his bones dissolving, his jaw deteriorating, holes forming in his skull, his body collapsing inward in a process that was described by those who saw him in his final months with a kind of muted, clinical horror that even the restraint of medical language could not entirely conceal. The Wall Street Journal, in April of 1932, published an article about Eben Byers under the headline, "The Radium Water Worked Fine," until his jaw fell off, a headline that combined the journalistic instinct for the arresting phrase with a clinical literalness that, however crudely expressed, captured something essential about the nature of what radium did to the people who consumed it. And the article was widely read and widely discussed and produced a shift in public awareness about radium tonics that no previous report had managed to achieve, partly because Byers was famous and wealthy and socially prominent, in a way that the factory workers whose radium injuries had been accumulating in the medical literature for years were not, and partly because the contrast between the vigorous, athletic man he had been in 1927 and the hollow, barely recognizable figure described in the article of 1932 was so complete and so devastating that even readers who had enthusiastically purchased radium water themselves could not avoid confronting. In the account of Byers' decline, some reflection of what they might have been doing to their own bodies. The Food and Drug Administration had issued warnings about Radithor as early as the late 1920s, had noted that the product's radium content made it potentially harmful, had requested that Bailey cease production, but had lacked, under the regulatory framework of the time, the legal authority to compel him to do so, and it was not until the publication of the Byers article and the national attention it attracted that the political and commercial pressure necessary to shut down Bailey's operations became sufficient to act, and Radithor disappeared from the market in 1932. The same year Eben Byers died, on April 14th, at the age of 51, his body so thoroughly saturated with radium that when it was exhumed in 1965 for radiological analysis, the levels of radioactivity in his remains were found to be significantly higher than the levels recorded at the time of his death, because the radium deposited in his bones had continued, in the quiet darkness of his lead-lined coffin, to decay through its long chain of daughter products, accumulating radiation, not decreasing it. And he lay in the earth, still glowing, still radiating, as he will continue to do for many centuries. Yet, a man who had purchased the radiance of his own destruction, one small glass bottle at a time. His death led directly to the strengthening of the Food and Drug Administration's powers, and contributed to the legislative momentum that would produce the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act of 1938, which greatly expanded the government's authority to regulate both pharmaceutical products and the claims that could be made about them, and which was perhaps the most significant piece of consumer protection legislation in the history of American public health up to that point. A legacy that emerged from tragedy with a quiet, unhurried inevitability, the way that most protective laws emerge, not in anticipation of harm, but in the long aftermath of it. While Eben Byers was drinking his way through those 1,400 bottles of Radithor in the drawing rooms and golf clubs of Pittsburgh and Newport, something rather different, and in some ways even more deeply sorrowful, was happening in the factories of New Jersey and Illinois, where young men, many of them still teenagers, many of them from immigrant families, were sitting at long tables in well-lit workrooms, applying radium paint to the dials of watches and military instruments, doing work that required precision and care and the particular kind of patient attention that fine manual work demands, and doing it, in the early years at least, without any protective equipment and without any warning about the properties of the substance they were handling, because the companies that employed them had been told by the scientists advising them that the quantities of radium involved were too small to be harmful, and because radium was, in the popular imagination, and even in the medical consensus of the early 1920s, still very much a beneficial rather than a dangerous substance. The United States Radium Corporation, operating out of Orange, New Jersey, had been hiring young women to paint watch dials since around 1917. And the Radium Dial Company in Ottawa, Illinois, had been doing the same since the early 1920s, employing at its peak around 1,000 young women who together produced approximately 4,300 painted dials each day, and the work was considered desirable employment. It was clean indoor work. It paid reasonably well compared to other options available to working women of that era, and there was even a kind of glamour associated with the radium paint, because the workers discovered that if they applied it to their skin and teeth and hair, they would glow in the dark, a novelty that produced no small amount of entertainment at the factories. Young women lighting up the darkened rooms and laughing at one another's luminescent reflections, entirely unaware that the element they were applying to their bodies for amusement was incorporating itself into their bones, and beginning, slowly and silently, the long process of destruction that would define the rest of their lives. The technique that would prove most damaging was one that had been standard practice in the factories from the beginning, encouraged by supervisors because it produced the finest possible brush tip for the precise application of paint to the small numerals of watch dials, and it consisted of placing the bristles of the radium-soaked brush between the lips and drawing them to a point with the tongue, a gesture so habitual and so automatic that workers repeated it dozens or hundreds of times each day without thought, ingesting with each repetition a tiny quantity of radium that joined all the other tiny quantities from all the other days and accumulated in the calcium-hungry tissue of their bones, their jaws, their spines, year after year, until the quantities were no longer tiny and the damage was no longer invisible. The illnesses began to appear with a quiet and terrible consistency in the early 1920s, beginning with dental problems, the loosening and loss of teeth, followed by the development of painful deterioration of the jaw and surrounding bone, a condition that came to be known as radium jaw in the medical literature of the period, though its cause was not immediately and universally accepted, even among the physicians who treated the affected women, because the idea that radium was harmful still ran against the grain of the prevailing medical opinion and the commercial interests of the companies involved, and because the symptoms in their early stages resembled those of ordinary dental disease sufficiently to provide plausible alternative explanations which certain company-affiliated physicians were not slow to offer. Grace Fryer, who had worked as a dial painter for the United States Radium Corporation in Orange, New Jersey, beginning around 1917, experienced the deterioration of her jaw and the fracturing of her spine in the early 1920s, and spent several years seeking a lawyer willing to take her case against the company before finding one who would act. And she was joined in her lawsuit by 4 other former dial painters: Catherine Schaub, Edna Hussman, Albina Larice, and Quinta MacDonald, whose names deserve to be spoken slowly and remembered because they were not wealthy socialites or well-connected industrialists, but working women of modest circumstances who were dying of an industrial disease that their employers had known about or had reason to know about and had concealed, and their decision to pursue legal remedy, despite their deteriorating health and limited financial resources, represented a form of courage as steady and as quiet and as persistent as the radium glow itself. The case attracted the attention of the New Jersey Consumers League, whose secretary Catherine Wiley provided crucial organizational and logistical support for the plaintiffs, and it attracted sustained and sympathetic newspaper coverage that transformed the 5 women into public figures, describing them as the Radium Girls and the Living Dead in headlines that carried the peculiar double weight of sensationalism and genuine grief. And the settlement reached in June of 1928 awarded each woman $10,000 plus a $600 annual annuity and coverage of their medical expenses, amounts that were modest given the severity of their injuries and the length of their suffering, but that represented, nonetheless, a legal acknowledgement that the company bore responsibility for what had happened to them. And this acknowledgement, however reluctant and however partial, was itself a kind of landmark in the history of occupational health law in the United States. The women of the Radium Dial Company in Ottawa, Illinois, faced a longer, and in some respects even more difficult road to legal recognition, because the Radium Dial Company, unlike the United States Radium Corporation, was financially structured in a way that made it difficult to compel it to honor any judgment that might be rendered against it. And because the legal proceedings in Illinois moved with a slowness that meant that many of the plaintiffs had died before their cases were resolved, and because the company's management maintained, with a consistency that became increasingly difficult to credit as the evidence mounted, that Radium was not responsible for the illnesses of their workers, that other factors were at play, that the science was uncertain, that the claims were exaggerated, and that the company had acted in good faith throughout, a set of positions that grew more untenable with each passing year, but that were defended nonetheless with all the resources that corporate legal representation could bring to bear against women who were dying in poverty. Among these women was Catherine Wolfe Donahue, who had worked for the Radium Dial Company in Ottawa, beginning in the early 1920s, and who, by the late 1930s, was bedridden and barely able to speak, her body so damaged by radium that she gave her final legal testimony from a stretcher carried into the courtroom, and her case was decided in 1938 by the Illinois Industrial Commission in a ruling that held the company responsible for her illness and ordered compensation, a ruling that the company appealed and that was not finally upheld until after Donahue's death, which occurred in July of 1938. And the decision in her case and the cases of her fellow workers was understood, even at the time, as a decision of significance that extended beyond the immediate circumstances of the dial painters, because it established legal principles around employer liability for occupational disease that would eventually shape the entire landscape of workplace safety regulation in the United States. And the creation of the Occupational Safety and Health Administration in 1970 is traceable through a long chain of legal and legislative precedent back to the courtrooms, where these women fought for recognition of what had been done to them during this same period throughout the 1920s and into the 1930s. The scientific understanding of radiation's effects on human tissue was being developed with increasing urgency and increasing alarm by researchers who had begun accumulating the clinical evidence that should have warned the world much earlier, but that had been slow to coalesce into a consensus clear enough to act upon, in part because the effects of radiation exposure were delayed, sometimes by years and sometimes by decades, between the original exposure and the appearance of clinical symptoms, which made the causal connection difficult to establish by the standards of evidence that medical science required, and in part because the economic interests invested in the radium industry were substantial and had incentives to fund and promote research that questioned or complicated the emerging evidence of harm. The work of researchers such as Frederick Hoffman, a statistician employed by the Prudential Insurance Company, who published a detailed analysis of radium-associated illness among dial painters in 1925, and Harrison Martland, a physician and pathologist who worked in New Jersey, and who conducted careful post-mortem examinations of deceased dial painters throughout the 1920s, establishing through painstaking radiological and biochemical analysis the presence of radium in the bones of the dead women, and documenting the pattern of bone destruction and malignancy that characterized radium poisoning was crucial to building the evidential foundation on which the legal and regulatory cases would eventually rest. And it is worth noting that both Hoffman and Maitland worked in the face of institutional skepticism and corporate resistance that must have been, at times, deeply discouraging, in the way that all work undertaken against entrenched interest is discouraging, requiring a patience and a steadiness that the historical record tends to compress into a narrative of progress that makes the outcome seem more inevitable than it ever felt to those living through it. The medical mechanism by which radium caused its damage was by this period becoming clearer, even if the full picture would not be assembled until several decades later. And the core of that mechanism was the chemical similarity between radium and calcium that caused the body's metabolic processes, which are designed to take up calcium from the bloodstream and deposit it in bone, to treat radium in exactly the same way, incorporating it into the mineral matrix of the skeleton, where it remained, unlike calcium, permanently radioactive, emitting alpha particles directly into the surrounding bone tissue from within. At a distance of micrometers, in a bombardment so intimate and so persistent that it could not fail, over a sufficient period of time, to damage the DNA of adjacent cells, disrupt the normal processes of bone formation and repair, and create the conditions for the development of the osteosarcomas and the bone necroses that characterized the late stages of radium poisoning. The Curies themselves were not immune to the damage that radium inflicted on those who worked closely with it, and Marie Curie, who had noted in the early years of their research that radium applications produced effects on the skin resembling burns, and who had used his own forearm as a surface on which to demonstrate these effects to colleagues, died in April of 1906 when he was struck by a horse-drawn wagon on the Rue Dauphine in Paris, a death that was accidental and sudden, and that spared him the slower deterioration that his wife would endure, though medical historians have noted that his notebooks and letters from the years before his death describe a persistent and worsening fatigue and bone pain that are consistent with the early stages of radiation-induced illness, and that he was, in the estimation of those who have reviewed the evidence, probably already significantly ill from radium exposure at the time of his death, though the accident obscured this fact from his contemporaries. Marie Curie continued her research after Pierre's death, taking over his professorship at the Sorbonne and becoming the first woman to hold a full professorship at that institution. And she continued to work with radium and other radioactive materials with the same methodical intensity that had characterized her approach to science from the beginning, carrying test tubes and files of radioactive material in the pockets of her laboratory coat, storing radioactive samples in her desk drawers, and generally inhabiting her working environment with a casualness about radiation exposure that reflected accurately the state of knowledge of the time, rather than any particular recklessness on her part, for she was doing what the best available science told her was safe to do. And the best available science was, on this particular point, devastatingly wrong. Her health declined gradually through the 1920s and early 1930s, marked by increasing fatigue, deteriorating vision caused by radiation-induced cataracts, and the progressive damage to her bone marrow that would eventually produce the aplastic anemia diagnosed in the final months of her life, and she died on the 4th of July 1934 at a sanatorium in Passy in the French Alps, her death attributed to aplastic anemia provoked by the prolonged action of radiation, as her physician wrote, a phrase that acknowledged, with the precision of medical language, the connection between the work of her life and the manner of its ending, the element she had named and isolated, and spent 40 years studying, having been, all along, a patient and invisible companion in her own slow departure from the world she had so thoroughly transformed. Her notebooks from the 1890s remain so highly radioactive today that they are stored in lead-lined boxes at the Bibliothèque Nationale de France, and researchers who wish to consult them must sign a waiver acknowledging the radiation risk and must wear protective equipment. And this fact, which is frequently noted as a curiosity, carries within it something that is not quite a metaphor, but functions like one, the idea of knowledge so hot with the energy of its own discovery that it cannot be safely handled even a century and a quarter after it was first set down, still radiating, still glowing, still carrying within it the trace of the woman who wrote it, and the element she found, and the extraordinary, devastating, world-changing thing that passed between them in that cold Parisian shed in the last years of the 19th century. Continuing seamlessly from where the story of Marie Curie's radium-soaked notebooks left off, we move now into the broader world that radium had made, a world in which the element's reputation was beginning, slowly and unevenly, to shift from miracle to menace, though the shift was gradual and contested, and never as clean or as swift as the retrospective narrative of scientific progress tends to suggest, because the history of public understanding of radiation risk is not a story of sudden revelation, but of accumulated evidence meeting sustained resistance, of truth arriving not in a flash, but in the manner of a long tide, advancing a little with each wave and retreating somewhat with each withdrawal, so that the waterline moves almost imperceptibly over months and years, until one day you look back from where you are standing and realize that the landscape has been entirely transformed, and the place where you once stood is submerged, and the old certainties have dissolved into something unrecognizable. It is worth considering in this seventh movement of our long, slow journey through the history of radium, what the regulatory landscape of Europe looked like during this same period, because the American experience of the radium craze, centered on Radithor and the dial painters, was not the whole story, but only one thread in a larger tapestry that stretched across the Atlantic and included the radium spas of Central Europe, the radioactive chocolate of France, the radium toothpastes of Germany, and the elaborate scientific frameworks that physicians and chemists in multiple countries had constructed to justify the therapeutic use of a substance whose dangers they did not yet fully apprehend. Germany in particular had developed, by the early 1920s, a sophisticated and commercially significant radium spa culture, centered on several towns whose natural springs contained measurable quantities of radioactive radon gas dissolved in the water, and the medical establishment's endorsement of radiobalneology, the therapeutic bathing in and drinking of radioactive waters, was not a fringe phenomenon, but a mainstream medical practice, taught in universities, practiced in licensed spa facilities, and covered by some early forms of health insurance. And the language used to describe its benefits was the language of science, rather than the language of quackery, drawing on the concepts of hormesis, the idea that small doses of a harmful agent might be stimulating to the body's defenses, a concept that remains a subject of scientific investigation to this day, and that provided, in the 1920s, a genuinely plausible theoretical framework for the belief that low-level radiation exposure was not merely harmless, but actively beneficial, a framework that was wrong in its practical application to radium tonics and bathing. But that was not obviously wrong in a way that the science of the time could definitively refute. The Radium Palace at Joachimsthal continued to receive thousands of visitors each year through the 1920s and into the 1930s, offering a program of radioactive baths, radon inhalation therapies, and medically supervised consumption of the local spring water that was described in its promotional literature with a tone of quiet, confident authority that left no room for doubt. And the patients who came there were not credulous fools, but often educated, thoughtful people who had received recommendations from their own physicians, who had read the scientific literature as it was then understood, and who had made what seemed, by the standards of the available evidence, a rational decision to seek treatment at an establishment that the medical community broadly endorsed. And the deeply sorrowful dimension of this fact is not the gullibility of the patients, but the genuine uncertainty of the science. The way that harm can accumulate in the gap between what we know and what we do not yet know, in the space where the evidence has not yet caught up with the damage being done. The advertising culture that grew up around radium products in the first 3 decades of the 20th century was considered as a cultural artifact, a document of extraordinary interest, because it reveals with unusual clarity the mechanisms by which scientific prestige can be appropriated and redirected by commercial interests, and the way in which the language of science, stripped of its uncertainty and its caveats and its institutional context, can be made to serve purposes that science itself would not endorse. And the radium advertisements of this period did this with a particular thoroughness, borrowing not just the vocabulary of radiation physics, but its visual iconography as well, covering product packaging in diagrams of atomic structure and graphs of radioactivity measurements and photographs of laboratory equipment, creating a visual language of scientific authority that communicated to consumers who lacked the technical knowledge to evaluate its accuracy that the product they were considering had been developed through rigorous investigation by credentialed experts and had been found by the methods of legitimate science to be safe and effective and worthy of their confidence and their money. The Thoradia company in France, which marketed a range of cosmetic products including face cream and powder and soap under a brand name that deliberately evoked thorium and radium, employed the image and the name of its fictional scientific authority, the invented Dr. Alfred Curie, on its packaging throughout the late 1920s and early 1930s. And the products sold widely and were reviewed favorably in women's magazines that described the radiance and clarity of complexion they supposedly produced, using a vocabulary of luminosity and vitality that rhymed in an entirely unintentional, but nonetheless revealing way, with the actual physical properties of radium, the glow that had made it famous in the first place, the cold blue light that had enchanted Marie Curie in her shed on the Rue Lomond, and that had, in passing through the distorting lens of commercial culture, been transformed into a metaphor for feminine beauty and youthful skin, into something purchasable and applicable and reassuring, emptied of its danger and retained only in its glamour. The Doramad radioactive toothpaste, manufactured in Germany in the late 1930s and early 1940s, offered consumers the assurance that its radioactive content would increase the defenses of teeth and gums through the biodynamic rays of its radium content. And the text of its advertising, which has survived in historical archives, is notable for the clinical precision of its claims, which are expressed in the language of cellular biology and dental medicine, and which would, to a reader without specialized knowledge, have been entirely indistinguishable from a legitimate scientific endorsement. And this is perhaps the most deeply troubling aspect of the radium advertising era, not the obvious frauds and the transparent exaggerations, but the carefully constructed, scientific sounding claims that colonized the vocabulary of medicine without submitting to its methods, that borrowed the credibility of expertise without accepting its accountability, and that produced in consumers a sense of informed confidence that was, in almost every case, entirely unwarranted. The commercial apparatus that had grown up around radium by the mid-1930s represented a significant economic interest, employing chemists and designers, and copywriters and salespeople and physicians who genuinely believed, in varying degrees, in the products they were promoting, and dismantling it required not merely the accumulation of medical evidence, but the construction of a regulatory framework capable of acting on that evidence. And the tension between these two processes, one scientific and one political, would define the middle decades of the 20th century's engagement with radiation risk. The scientific community's understanding of how radiation damaged living tissue was developing through the 1930s and into the 1940s, along two parallel tracks that would eventually converge into the modern field of radiation biology. And the first of these tracks was clinical, built from the observation and careful documentation of radiation-injured individuals, the dial tile painters and the radium water drinkers, and the early radiation workers, and the patients who had received therapeutic radiation for various conditions whose bodies provided, in their damage and their decline, a kind of involuntary evidence about the mechanisms of radiation harm that no deliberate experimental program could have ethically produced. And the second track was laboratory-based, emerging from experiments on cells and tissues and small organisms that allowed researchers to study the effects of ionizing radiation in controlled conditions and to begin developing the theoretical framework that would explain, at the level of molecular biology, precisely what radiation did to the structures inside a living cell. The crucial insight that would eventually unite these two tracks was the understanding that ionizing radiation, the kind emitted by radium and its decay products, damaged living tissue, primarily by interacting with the DNA molecules that carried the genetic information within each cell, breaking the chemical bonds that held the double helix together, creating breaks in the strands of the molecule that the cell's repair mechanisms would attempt to fix, but that, when the damage was sufficiently extensive or sufficiently repeated, could not be fully corrected, leaving behind alterations in the genetic code that might cause the cell to malfunction, to reproduce without the normal regulatory controls, to become, in the clinical language that would develop to describe this condition, malignant, and this mechanism, fully described only with the development of molecular biology in the 1950s and 1960s, was the deep explanation for the cancers and the bone necroses that had been observed in radium workers since the early 1920s, the molecular translation of a pattern of harm that had been visible at the clinical level for decades before it was explicable at the cellular one. Herman Joseph Muller, an American geneticist working at the University of Texas, demonstrated in 1927 that X-ray radiation caused mutations in the genetics of the fruit fly, Drosophila melanogaster, a finding for which he would receive the Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine in 1946. And while Muller's work concerned X-rays rather than alpha radiation, of the kind emitted by radium, it was part of the broader scientific conversation about radiation and genetic damage that was, throughout the late 1920s and 1930s, building the conceptual architecture within which the specific dangers of radium would eventually be fully understood, and it is worth noting that Muller was, from an early date, a vocal and persistent advocate for public awareness of radiation risk, speaking and writing with an urgency that was sometimes unwelcome in a period when the uses of radiation were still more often framed in terms of benefit than of danger. The development of the concept of radiation dose, the idea that the biological effects of radiation exposure were a function not just of the kind of radiation involved, but of the quantity received and the rate at which it was received, was an important conceptual advance that allowed researchers to begin quantifying risk and setting safety thresholds, though the history of radiation protection standards is itself a long and complicated story of thresholds set and revised and set again, as the evidence of harm extended into dose ranges that earlier frameworks had considered safe, a story that would continue through the Manhattan Project and the post-war nuclear era. And that has not yet reached its final chapter, because the question of what constitutes a safe level of radiation exposure remains, in certain dose ranges and certain contexts, a subject of ongoing scientific investigation and regulatory debate. The story of radium cannot be told without attending to the story of World War I, which created the conditions for radium's most significant legitimate medical application, and simultaneously accelerated the commercial exploitation that would cause so much harm in the following decade. Because the war that engulfed Europe between 1914 and 1918 produced millions of casualties whose wounds were severe and whose treatment required diagnostic tools of unprecedented power and range. And Marie Curie recognized, with characteristic clarity and practicality, that the portable X-ray equipment she had helped develop in the years before the war could be brought directly to the field hospitals and surgical theaters near the front lines, where the wounded men were being treated, rather than requiring those men to be transported to fixed hospitals where X-ray facilities were already in place. And she designed and equipped a fleet of vehicles, small trucks fitted with X-ray equipment and powered by a portable generator that became known as Petites Curies, or Little Curies, and she drove one of them herself to the battlefields of northern France and Belgium, learning to operate the X-ray equipment and to train the military nurses and orderlies who would use it, and in doing so contributing directly to the treatment of an estimated 1 million soldiers over the course of the war, a contribution that went unrecognized for many years in the official military accounts of the war, because she was a woman and a civilian and a foreigner, and that has been gradually recovered by historians in the century since. Her daughter Irene, who was 17 when the war began, and who had grown up in the laboratories where her parents worked, assisted her mother in operating the Little Curies and in training others in the use of radiological equipment, gaining in the process a practical experience of radiation physics and medical application that would inform her own subsequent scientific career, and the two of them, mother and daughter, moving through the devastated landscapes of wartime France in their little truck with its precious cargo of electrical equipment, represent one of the more remarkable pairings in the history of science. The woman who had discovered radium and her daughter who would go on, with her husband Frédéric Joliot, to discover artificial radioactivity in 1934, a discovery for which they would receive the Nobel Prize in Chemistry in 1935, completing a family tally of 4 Nobel Prizes across 2 generations that has never been equaled in the history of science. The war also created, as wars tend to do, an enormous demand for precision instruments, including watches and clocks and navigational equipment, all of which required luminous dials that could be read in the darkness of trenches and airplanes and ships. And this demand drove a rapid expansion of the dial painting industry in both the United States and Europe that would, in the years immediately following the armistice, leave a substantial workforce of dial painters in place, trained and employed, and entirely uninformed about the nature of the substance they handled daily, in factories whose management had not, in most cases, seriously considered the possibility that their workers might be in danger, or, if they had considered it, had not considered it seriously enough to act. The military application of radium-painted instruments thus created the industrial infrastructure of the dial painting factories, and the dial painting factories created the conditions for the occupational catastrophe that would unfold through the 1 and 92, zeros and 1930s. And this chain of connection between wartime necessity and peacetime tragedy is one of those historical patterns that becomes visible only in retrospect, only when enough time has passed to see the whole arc of consequence that unfolds from a single decision made under the pressure of a crisis that seemed in the moment to demand nothing more than practical ingenuity and efficient production. It is worth pausing here to consider the experience of the dial painters themselves, not merely as legal cases or as evidence in a medical argument, but as human beings going about their working lives in conditions that were, by the standards of the time, considered perfectly ordinary, young women arriving each morning at clean, well-lit workrooms, sitting down at long tables alongside friends and sisters and neighbors, picking up their small brushes, dipping them into the luminous paint, and beginning the careful, repetitive work of placing small dots of light onto the tiny numerals of watch dials, work that required a steady hand and a patient eye, and the kind of quiet concentration that is its own form of meditation, and that paid, by the early 1920s, somewhere between $17 and $20 a week, which was a wage that compared favorably to the alternatives available to women of their social class in that period. And that allowed them, in many cases, to contribute significantly to their family's income, or to save toward futures. They were planning with the ordinary confidence of young people who have no particular reason to doubt that they will have futures worth planning for. Grace Fryer, who became one of the 5 plaintiffs in the 1927 New Jersey lawsuit, had been, before her illness, a sociable and energetic young woman who enjoyed dancing, and who had been proud of her work and her wages, and the years of illness that followed her employment at the United States Radium Corporation did not diminish her determination, though they diminished nearly everything else. And when she finally found an attorney willing to take her case, after years of being turned away by lawyers who either doubted the case's merits or feared the corporate resources that would be arrayed against them, she pursued it with a steadiness that contemporaries described as remarkable given the physical condition in which she was pursuing it. Already in a back brace, already in pain, already aware that the time available to her for the pursuit of any kind of justice was finite in a way that made each delay more costly. Albina Larice, another of the 5 New Jersey plaintiffs, had worked at the dial factory for several years before her illness, and her husband had also been employed there in a different capacity, and both of them became ill. And the pattern of illness within the factory and within the families of those who worked there was, to those with eyes to see it, a pattern that told a clear story. But the telling of clear stories about industrial harm requires not just the accumulation of evidence, but the willingness of institutions to hear it. And that willingness was slow in coming, requiring years of legal work and medical documentation and public pressure before the connection between the factories and the illnesses was formally and legally established. The women of Ottawa, Illinois, who worked for the Radium Dial Company, faced the additional difficulty of a company that had observed the New Jersey litigation and had drawn from it the lesson not that it needed to better protect its workers, but that it needed to be more careful about what it documented and what it acknowledged, and the medical examinations conducted on Ottawa workers by company-affiliated physicians were, historians have subsequently established, deliberately designed to obscure rather than reveal the presence of radium-related damage. And the results of those examinations were withheld from the workers themselves, who were told that they were healthy even when the evidence of their own deteriorating bodies was telling them something quite different, a deception so sustained and so systematic that it becomes, in retrospect, very difficult to describe in the measured clinical language that the principles of historical distance suggest, and one finds oneself reaching for words that are heavier than mere clinical description can bear. The scientific and medical community's response to the accumulating evidence of radium's dangers was, through the 1920s and into the 1930s, characterized by a division between those who acknowledged the evidence and those who disputed it, and this division did not fall neatly along the line between honest researchers and dishonest ones, because the picture was complicated by genuine scientific uncertainty, by the difficulty of establishing causation from correlation in a population of workers who might have been exposed to other occupational hazards, by the long latency between exposure and clinical symptom that made retrospective analysis difficult, and by the institutional and commercial pressures that shaped the questions researchers asked and the conclusions they were permitted to publish. Frederick Flynn, a Columbia University physiologist who had been hired by the United States Radium Corporation to conduct medical examinations of its dial painters in the mid-1920s, produced reports that consistently minimized the connection between radium exposure and the workers' illnesses, describing the women's symptoms as attributable to a variety of causes, and recommending continued employment in conditions that his own data, had he analyzed it differently, would have supported describing as dangerous. And while the full extent of his relationship with the company and the degree to which his conclusions were shaped by that relationship, rather than by the evidence itself, have been debated by historians, the record of his testimony in the New Jersey proceedings suggests, at the very least, a research posture shaped by something other than purely disinterested inquiry, and his reports were used by the company throughout the legal proceedings to support its position that the illnesses of the workers had other explanations, a use that Flynn himself did not publicly repudiate at the time. Against this, the work of Harrison Martland, whose post-mortem examinations of deceased dial painters through the late 1920s established, with increasing clarity and rigor, the presence of radium in the bones of the dead and the pattern of damage its presence had caused, built an evidentiary record that became progressively harder to dispute, and Martland published his findings in the Journal of the American Medical Association in articles that were read widely within the medical profession, and that contributed significantly to the shift in medical consensus that occurred in the late 1920s and early 1930s. A shift that had real but delayed effects on the regulatory and commercial landscape, because the mechanisms for translating scientific consensus into protective action were still rudimentary and contested. The role of journalism in this period deserves particular acknowledgement because it was the press, rather than the regulatory agencies, that first brought the condition of the dial painters to broad public attention, with reporters for the Newark Star Eagle and the New York World filing stories in 1925 and 1926 that described the illnesses of the orange workers in terms that were accessible and sympathetic, and that prompted the public interest that the legal proceedings subsequently drew on, and the tradition of investigative journalism in the service of public health, which extends forward through the 20th century, through coverage of tobacco, asbestos, lead paint, and many other industrial health crises, draws one of its clearer lines of ancestry back to the reporters who stood outside the courtrooms, where the Radium girls were fighting and wrote down what they heard with the particular attention that is owed to people fighting for their lives against forces much larger than themselves. The development of radiation safety standards in the late 1920s and early 1930s, beginning with the work of the International X-ray and Radium Protection Committee, which was established in 1928, and which would eventually evolve into the International Commission on Radiological Protection, represented the beginning of the institutional framework through which the scientific community's understanding of radiation's risk would be translated into guidelines and regulations, a process that was slow and imperfect, and that would require many revisions in the decades to come as the evidence of harm extended into dose ranges that early frameworks had considered safe, but that represented nonetheless a genuine beginning of the systematic approach to radiation protection that the world would urgently need as nuclear technology expanded in the following decades. The decade of the 1930s saw the radium health craze enter its long, gradual decline, driven by the convergence of several forces that had been building independently, and that came together in this period with sufficient combined weight to shift the public perception of radium from beneficial to dangerous, though the shift was not instantaneous and was not complete by the end of the decade, and vestiges of the therapeutic radium culture would persist in various corners of the world, well into the second half of the 20th century, because the psychological and commercial infrastructure of belief, once built, does not dismantle quickly, and there are always those who resist the evidence when the evidence costs them something they valued. The death of Eben Byers in April 1932 and the Wall Street Journal article that brought his condition to national attention was perhaps the single most important event in shifting American public opinion, because it attached the abstract danger of radium consumption to a specific, named, wealthy, previously healthy individual whose decline was documented in detail and whose condition was described with enough clinical specificity that readers could not mistake it for an exaggeration or a misdiagnosis. And the fact that Byers was wealthy and socially prominent worked, in this instance, in the service of public awareness rather than against it, because his prominence meant that his story was told in newspapers that reached audiences far beyond the working class communities where the dial painters lived, and where the industrial health consequences of radium had been accumulating for years, without producing comparable national attention. The federal response to Byers's death was not immediate, but it was eventually substantial, contributing, as noted earlier, to the legislative momentum behind the Federal Food, Drug and Cosmetic Act of 1938, which transformed the regulatory landscape for pharmaceutical products in the United States, and gave the Food and Drug Administration powers of oversight and enforcement that it had previously lacked. And the passage of this act while prompted by several different public health crises of the 1930s, including the sulfonamide disaster of 1937, in which more than 100 people died from a toxic solvent used in a liquid antibiotic formulation, drew on the political and public concern about patent medicines and fraudulent health products that the radium story had done much to generate and sustain. Meanwhile, in Europe, the Second World War, which began in September 1939, disrupted the commercial landscape of the spa and health industries so thoroughly that many of the radioactive spa facilities that had flourished in the 1920s and 1930s never fully recovered their pre-war clientele, their infrastructure damaged or repurposed during the conflict, and their post-war marketing complicated by the radically altered cultural context that atomic weapons had created, in which radiation was now associated not with gentle therapeutic vitality, but with the sudden, total, unprecedented destructive force that had been demonstrated over Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945, and in which the idea of deliberately consuming radioactive materials struck a post-war public very differently than it had struck a pre-war one. The cultural shift produced by Hiroshima and Nagasaki was profound and lasting, even if its specific effects on the remnants of the radium health culture were somewhat diffuse and unevenly distributed across different societies and different commercial contexts. And it is one of the more somber ironies of the 20th century that the same element whose most famous compounds had been sold as tonics and face creams and toothpastes in the 1920s was also, through the physics of nuclear fission, a distant cousin of the processes that produced the atomic bomb, separated from those processes by several decades of scientific development and by a fundamental distinction in mechanism, but connected to them by the common thread of radioactivity, of the energy released by the instability of certain atomic nuclei. The same energy that Marie Curie had first measured in her electrometer in 1897, and that the world of 1945 had encountered in the most devastating possible form. The story of radium in the years following World War II is in some respects the story of reckoning, of the slow, institutional process by which societies acknowledge what has been done, compensate those who were harmed, and build the regulatory and scientific frameworks intended to prevent comparable harm in the future. And this reckoning was partial and delayed and contested in the ways that all reckonings with industrial harm tend to be, never fully adequate to the scale of the suffering it was responding to, always arriving later than it should have, always giving back less than was taken, but representing nonetheless a genuine, if imperfect, movement toward the acknowledgement that the protection of working people from industrial hazard is a responsibility of employers and governments that cannot be discharged by ignorance, whether genuine or convenient. The Radium Dial Company in Ottawa, Illinois, had been reorganized during the late 1930s as Luminous Processes Incorporated, a change of corporate identity that its management used to argue that it no longer bore the legal liabilities of its predecessor, and the question of whether this reorganization constituted a genuine change of corporate identity or merely a legal stratagem to escape liability pursued the company and its successor for years through the Illinois courts, with the workers and their families on one side, and the company's legal representatives on the other, and the resolution of these cases extended in some instances well beyond the deaths of the original plaintiffs, leaving widowers and children and parents in the position of pursuing claims for compensation for losses they had witnessed in intimate and devastating detail. The town of Ottawa, Illinois, bore a particular relationship to the legacy of the Radium Dial Company because the factory had been located within the residential fabric of the town, and the contamination associated with its operations had spread beyond the factory itself into the surrounding community, present in the soil of neighboring properties, in the material used as landfill in various locations around the town, and researchers who conducted environmental surveys of Ottawa in the 1980s found elevated levels of radium contamination in a significant number of locations across the community, leading to the designation of parts of Ottawa as a Superfund hazardous waste site under the Comprehensive Environmental Response, Compensation and Liability Act, and to a cleanup program that extended over many years and involved the excavation and removal of contaminated soil from residential properties and public spaces, a program that brought the continuing legacy of the dial painting era into the lives of Ottawa residents who had been born decades after the factories closed, discovering that the past had not passed but had simply been waiting in the soil beneath their feet for someone to measure it. The legal settlements and regulatory changes of the post-war period did not address, and could not address, the suffering that had already been endured. The women who had died in the 1920s and 1930s, the families broken by illness and poverty, and the long years of fighting for recognition. The specific human texture of all that loss, which is not accessible to the language of law or of regulation, which exists in the space between official records and can only be approached obliquely through the letters and diaries and newspaper accounts that have survived, through the names spoken slowly and with care: Grace Fryer, Catherine Schaub, Edna Hussman, Albina Larice, Quinta MacDonald, Catherine Wolfe Donahue, Margaret Looney, Charlotte Nevins, and all the others whose names appear in the medical records and the court documents and the newspaper reports of those years. Women who were harmed by their employers' disregard for their safety and who spent what remained of their lives fighting, quietly and steadily, for the acknowledgement that what had been done to them had been wrong. The broader legacy of the Radium era for the development of occupational health law in the United States is one of the more significant but least widely recognized contributions of the dial painters' legal struggles, extending far beyond the specific question of radium exposure, shaped the foundational principles of industrial safety regulation that would govern American workplaces for the rest of the 20th century and into the 21st. The concept of employer liability for occupational disease, which seems obvious and unremarkable to the contemporary reader, was not obvious or unremarkable in the legal landscape of the 1920s, when the prevailing doctrine in many American states held that workers who accepted employment in industrial settings took on themselves the inherent risks of that employment, a doctrine known as assumption of risk that had been developed in an earlier era of industrial capitalism. And that, in its application to the dial painters, would have meant that the women who had been advised by their supervisors to lip point their brushes, and who had done so in good faith had, by accepting employment in a factory that used radium, assumed the risk of being harmed by that radium, regardless of whether they had been informed of that risk, and regardless of whether their employer had understood the risk itself. The New Jersey settlement of 1928 did not overturn this doctrine in law, but it demonstrated in practice that a well-documented case of occupational disease, pursued with sufficient public attention and legal skill, could produce a result for injured workers, even within the constraints of the existing legal framework, and the subsequent cases in Illinois and elsewhere built on this precedent, establishing through accumulated practice what would eventually be enshrined through legislation, namely that employers had an affirmative duty to protect their workers from known hazards, and that ignorance of a hazard did not excuse an employer who could reasonably have been expected to investigate and know. The creation of the Occupational Safety and Health Administration in 1970, under the administration of President Richard Nixon, was the culmination of a decades-long legislative effort to establish a federal agency with the authority and the resources to set and enforce workplace safety standards across the American economy, and the intellectual and political genealogy of that effort includes, among its most significant early chapters, the work done by the lawyers and physicians and journalists and labor advocates who supported the dial painters in their legal struggles of the 1920s and 1930s. People like Catherine Wiley of the New Jersey Consumers League, like the attorney Raymond Berry, who eventually agreed to take Grace Fryer's case, like the physician Alice Hamilton, the pioneering occupational health researcher at Harvard, who had been documenting industrial disease since the early 1910s, and whose work provided much of the scientific framework within which the dial painter cases were understood. The history of protective regulation is, nearly always, the history of harm that occurred before protection was in place. The history of people who were hurt before anyone with authority decided that preventing similar hurt was worth the institutional effort. And the history of radium is in this sense deeply representative, a story that follows the familiar and deeply sorrowful arc from initial enthusiasm through the accumulation of harm, through the slow construction of remedy, a story whose middle section, the years of harm, is longer and more densely populated than its beginning or its end. As the 20th century moved through its middle decades and the commercial radium industry faded into history, the scientific understanding of radium's properties and its biological effects was deepening in ways that had implications far beyond the specific story of the dial painters and the radium water drinkers. Because radium and its decay products, particularly radon, were present not only in industrial settings and patent medicines, but in the natural environment, in soil and rock and groundwater, and the air of basements and lower floors of buildings constructed above certain geological formations, and the question of what level of environmental exposure to naturally occurring radioactive materials constituted a significant health risk would become, in the post-war decades, a matter of increasing scientific and regulatory attention as the tools for measuring very low levels of radioactivity improved, and as the understanding of radiation's carcinogenic effects became more precise and more quantitative. The connection between radon gas and lung cancer, which is now the second leading cause of lung cancer in the United States, after cigarette smoking, and is responsible for an estimated 21,000 deaths per year in that country alone, was established through a combination of epidemiological studies of uranium miners who were exposed to very high concentrations of radon in unventilated underground workings, and who developed lung cancer at dramatically elevated rates, and studies of residential radon exposure in populations living above uranium-bearing geological formations, and the regulatory response to this evidence. The development of radon testing and mitigation standards for residential buildings represents one of the more direct lines of descent from the radium era's scientific legacy into contemporary public health practice, a line that passes through the dial painter research and the studies of radium water consumers and the work of post-war radiation biologists in a continuous thread of accumulating understanding. The uranium miners, whose lung cancer rates provided much of the epidemiological evidence for the radon lung cancer connection, were, in many cases, workers who had no more awareness of the health implications of their occupation than the dial painters of Orange and Ottawa had had a generation earlier. And the history of their exposure and illness follows patterns recognizable from the earlier story, patterns of industrial need and inadequate protection and delayed recognition and contested liability that suggests something about the pace at which societies learn from the experience of those who work most closely with the materials that the broader economy requires, a pace that is almost always slower than the accumulation of harm and almost always insufficient to prevent the suffering it eventually moves to address. The natural radioactivity of the Earth, from which radium itself derives, and which Marie Curie's work had first brought into precise scientific focus, is of course not a human creation, and not subject to any regulatory framework that humans might devise. And the radon that seeps from granite foundations into the lower floors of millions of homes around the world is a permanent feature of living on a planet made of elements, some fraction of which are naturally radioactive, a condition of existence that predates humanity by billions of years, and that will continue long after the last of the luminous watch dials has faded, and the last of the radium water bottles has been emptied and catalogued in a museum display case. And the story of humanity's encounter with radium is, in this larger perspective, the story of a species learning, at considerable cost, something fundamental about the nature of the physical world in which it lives, a lesson paid for in the health and lives of the people whose suffering generated the evidence on which the understanding eventually rested. The legacy of Marie Curie's discovery of radium, considered across the full span of the century, and a quarter that separates us from that cold December announcement of 1898, is a legacy of profound ambivalence, woven from threads of genuine scientific achievement and devastating unintended consequence of knowledge pursued with extraordinary integrity and deployed by others with extraordinary recklessness, of an element that has saved lives through radiation oncology and taken them through radiation poisoning, that has been at once a tool of healing and a tool of harm, that has occupied simultaneously the registers of the miraculous and the tragic, and that continues to be present in the world in ways both visible and invisible. In the background radiation of the natural environment, in the radiological equipment of modern hospitals, in the faded but still radioactive traces that remain in the soil of Ottawa, Illinois, and in the lead-lined boxes at the Bibliothèque Nationale de France, where the notebooks of the woman who named it rest in their necessary darkness. The story of radium is also the story of how societies respond to new knowledge, of the gap that exists between the discovery of a fact and the social and institutional responses that the fact demands, and of the tendency of commercial interest to fill that gap with product before scientific understanding has progressed far enough to evaluate the risks of doing so, a tendency that the history of radium illustrates with unusual clarity, because the timeline of the radium craze runs parallel to the timeline of the scientific investigation of radiation harm in a way that makes the relationship between them unusually legible, the advertisements and the medical reports appearing in the same decades, sometimes in the same publications, speaking different languages about the same substance, one language promising health and vitality and radiant beauty, the other slowly carefully, evidentially describing what radium was actually doing to the people who consumed it. The women who worked in the dial painting factories and who fought for recognition of their injuries occupy a place in this story that is not merely that of victims, but of agents, of people who took the evidence of their own bodies and the fact of their own suffering and used it as effectively as their circumstances permitted to compel institutions that did not wish to be compelled into acknowledging what they knew or should have known. And in doing so, they changed, permanently and for the better, the legal and regulatory landscape of occupational health in the United States, a change that has protected many thousands of workers in the decades since, from industrial hazards that might otherwise have gone unaddressed for far longer. And it is right that their names should be spoken, and that their story should be told, even here, in the long quiet hours of the night, with no urgency and no drama, just the slow accumulation of fact laid gently against the darkness, the way that history itself accumulates, one record at a time, one life at a time, one small bright bottle of consequence at a time, glowing softly in the archive of everything human beings have done and suffered and understood, here in the world that radium helped to make. The previous 6 chapters, covering chapters 7 through 12, have been fully completed in the prior response. We now continue without interruption into the final movement of our long, quiet journey through the history of radium, picking up the thread where it was last set down, in the archive of consequence, in the fading glow of all that the element had done, and all that it had cost, and carrying it forward through the decades that followed, through the post-war world, and the nuclear age, and the slow institutional reckoning, and the gradual fading of radium, from the headlines of daily life into the quieter registers of scientific history and legal precedent, where it rests now, still warm with significance, still radiating meaning, at a rate that does not diminish with the passing years. The post-war period in the United States and Europe brought with it a transformation in the cultural relationship to radioactivity that was so complete and so swift that it is difficult from the distance of the present day to fully reconstruct how total the reversal was, how thoroughly the image of radiation as a source of vitality and health was replaced. In the space of a very few years, between 1945 and 1950, by the image of radiation as a force of destruction, on a scale that previous generations had not possessed the conceptual vocabulary to imagine, because the atomic bombs detonated over Hiroshima on the 6th of August, 1945, and over Nagasaki on the 9th of August, 1945, did not merely destroy those cities and kill their inhabitants in the immediate blast and heat and radiation of the explosions themselves, but also introduced into the global cultural consciousness a new and indelible understanding of what the release of nuclear energy on a large scale looked like, felt like, and meant. An understanding that was carried back to the waiting world in the dispatches of journalists, in the testimony of survivors, in the medical reports of the physicians who documented the effects of acute radiation sickness in those who had survived the initial blasts, only to die in the weeks that followed from the systemic devastation that high-dose radiation exposure produced in the human body. The survivors of the Hiroshima and Nagasaki bombings, known in Japanese as hibakusha, meaning explosion-affected people, became, in the years following the war, the subjects of the most intensive and comprehensive study of human radiation exposure ever conducted, carried out by the Atomic Bomb Casualty Commission, established in 1946, which monitored the health outcomes of approximately 120,000 survivors over the subsequent decades, tracking the incidence of leukemia, solid tumors, cardiovascular disease, and other health outcomes in a population whose radiation doses had been carefully estimated and whose medical histories were documented with extraordinary thoroughness. And the data generated by this ongoing study has formed the empirical backbone of most of the radiation risk models used by international regulatory agencies since the 1950s. Models that have been revised and refined as the study has continued, and as the follow-up period has lengthened, and as statistical techniques for analyzing the data have improved. But that rest on this foundation of human experience, on the health records of people who were in Hiroshima and Nagasaki on 2 mornings in August 1945, and whose bodies have been, in the decades since, the primary source of our quantitative understanding of what radiation does to human health across a range of doses and a range of time. The cultural shock of Hiroshima and Nagasaki was not merely a matter of scale, of the difference between the microcuries of radium in a bottle of Radithor and the energy released by a fission weapon, but a matter of the sudden, the irreversible obsolescence of the entire framework of benign radioactivity that the radium era had constructed, because the same physics that explained why radium glowed and why Radithor made its drinkers feel warm also explained, at a deeper level, the energy released by nuclear fission. And after August 1945, it was no longer possible for most people to contemplate the word radioactive and think of health spas and luminous cosmetics. The word had been permanently and irrevocably rewritten, and the rewriting was so thorough that the earlier meaning became almost inaccessible, almost incomprehensible, requiring a deliberate act of historical imagination to recover. The radium products that had been on sale in pharmacies and health food shops and department stores throughout the 1920s and 1930s were gone by the post-war period, swept away by the combined effect of regulatory action, shifting public opinion, the death or disgrace of their most prominent advocates, and the new cultural context that made their existence seem not merely misguided, but, in retrospect, almost surreal. And the artifacts of the radium craze, the old bottles of Radithor, the tins of Thoradia cream, the Doramad toothpaste tubes, the radium pad applicators, and the uranium glass tableware, passed into the category of historical curiosities, collected by specialists and displayed in museum cases, and described in the footnotes of medical history texts, where they remain today as evidence of a particular moment in the history of human credulity and commercial ingenuity that the intervening decades have made safely distant and appropriately strange. The scientific legacy of Marie Curie's discovery of radium extended far beyond the element itself, branching outward through the 20th century in directions that Curie herself could not have anticipated, and that have reshaped medicine, physics, energy production, and the understanding of the cosmos in ways that remain active and consequential in the present day. And the first and most immediately significant of these branches was the development of radiation therapy as a legitimate and effective treatment for certain types of cancer, which built directly on the early observations that radium placed near cancerous tissue could cause that tissue to shrink and sometimes to disappear, and which has evolved over the century since those early observations into a sophisticated clinical discipline employing precisely controlled beams of ionizing radiation, delivered with extraordinary accuracy to tumor targets, while sparing surrounding healthy tissue, and used in the treatment of approximately half of all cancer patients in high-income countries. at some point during their illness. The development of nuclear medicine, a related field that uses radioactive isotopes, both for diagnostic imaging and for targeted therapy, represents another branch of the same scientific lineage. Employing the principle that certain radioactive substances, when introduced into the body, will preferentially accumulate in specific tissues or organs, allowing physicians either to image those tissues by detecting the radiation emitted by the accumulated isotope or to deliver a therapeutic radiation dose to a targeted site. And the diagnostic technique of positron emission tomography or PET scanning, which is now routine in oncology and neurology and cardiology, is a direct technological descendant of the understanding of radioactive decay that Marie Curie developed in her laboratory in the 1890s, translated through decades of physics and engineering and medical research into a device that generates three-dimensional images of metabolic activity inside the living body with a precision and resolution that would have been entirely unimaginable to a physician of the early 20th century. The discovery of artificial radioactivity by Irène Joliot-Curie and Frédéric Joliot in 1934, the same year that Marie Curie died, opened the possibility of producing radioactive isotopes of any element by bombarding stable nuclei with alpha particles in the laboratory, liberating the medical and scientific uses of radioactivity from dependence on the naturally occurring radioactive elements like radium and uranium, and allowing the production of isotopes tailored to specific diagnostic or therapeutic purposes. And this discovery, for which Irène and Frédéric received the Nobel Prize in Chemistry in 1935, is one of the more poignant moments in the Curie family's scientific legacy. The daughter building on her mother's foundation in the year of her mother's death, carrying the lineage of discovery forward in a way that would have, one imagines, given Marie Curie some measure of satisfaction had she lived long enough to see the Nobel Prize announcement in Stockholm. The Manhattan Project, the American-led effort to develop nuclear weapons during World War II, drew heavily on the foundational physics of radioactivity that Becquerel and the Curies had established. And while the connection between the discovery of radium in a Parisian shed in 1898 and the development of nuclear weapons in the laboratories of Los Alamos, New Mexico, between 1942 and 1945, passes through many intermediate scientific steps and involves the contributions of dozens of researchers, the line of intellectual descent is real and traceable. And it means that the woman who worked in isolation in an unheated laboratory in Paris, driven by nothing more than the desire to understand why uranium ore emitted more radiation than the uranium it contained, set in motion a chain of scientific consequence whose furthest reach included not only the hospitals that use radiation to treat cancer, but also the weapons that remain to this day, the most destructive instruments that human civilization has ever constructed. The question of what constitutes a safe level of radiation exposure, which had been present in the scientific literature since at least the late 1920s, when the International X-ray and Radium Protection Committee first attempted to formalize safety guidelines, became significantly more urgent in the post-war period, as nuclear technology expanded into civilian as well as military applications, and the question was not merely scientific, but deeply political, shaped by the interests of nuclear weapons programs, nuclear power industries, and the medical establishments of multiple countries, all of which had reasons to prefer regulatory frameworks that permitted substantial radiation exposures without legal liability, and all of which participated through their scientific representatives and their government liaisons in the ongoing debates about what the evidence actually showed and what it implied for permissible dose limits. The linear no-threshold model of radiation risk, which holds that any exposure to ionizing radiation, however small, carries some finite risk of causing cancer, and that this risk is proportional to the dose received with no safe threshold, below which the risk becomes zero, became the dominant framework for radiation protection regulation through the post-war decades and remains the basis of most current regulatory standards, and its adoption was a direct consequence of the evidence accumulated from dial painters, radium water drinkers, uranium miners, atomic bomb survivors, and radiation therapy patients. Evidence that consistently showed an increase in cancer risk with increasing dose, and that failed to reveal any dose level at which the risk clearly fell to zero. Though the debate about whether a genuine threshold exists at very low doses continues in the scientific literature and has not been definitively resolved, the establishment of the International Commission on Radiological Protection in 1950, reorganized from the earlier committee established in 1928, created the institutional framework through which the scientific consensus on radiation risk was translated into internationally recognized guidelines that informed the regulations of national governments and international agencies, and the ICARP's periodic reviews of the evidence and revisions of its recommendations have shaped the radiation protection landscape of the nuclear age, from the permissible dose limits for radiation workers, to the safety standards for nuclear power plants, to the guidelines for the use of radiation in medical diagnosis and therapy. And the lineage of these standards extends back through the occupational health investigations of the 1920s and 1930s, to the bodies of the women who painted watch dials in New Jersey and Illinois, whose suffering generated the first quantitative data on the health effects of internal radium contamination in human beings. The nuclear power industry, which developed through the 1950s and 1960s with the promise of electricity too cheap to meter, as the famous phrase attributed to Lewis Strauss of the Atomic Energy Commission expressed it, brought radiation risk into a new set of social and political contexts, creating public debates about reactor safety, nuclear waste disposal, and the appropriate level of radiation exposure for populations living near nuclear facilities, that drew on the same scientific frameworks and engaged many of the same regulatory institutions that had been developed in response to the radium era and the accidents at 3 Mile Island in Pennsylvania in 1979, at Chernobyl in Ukraine in 1986, and at Fukushima in Japan in 2011. Each generated renewed public and scientific attention to the health effects of radiation exposure that refreshed, in each generation, the fundamental questions about risk and protection and institutional accountability that the dial painters had first forced into public consciousness more than half a century earlier. The continuing presence of radium and its legacy in the contemporary world is thus not merely historical but active, expressed in the safety standards that govern nuclear facilities, in the dosimetry protocols that protect medical radiation workers, in the radon testing programs that identify elevated radioactivity in residential buildings, in the Superfund cleanup programs that address legacy contamination at sites associated with the early radium industry, and in the ongoing monitoring of the health of populations exposed to elevated radiation levels from both industrial and natural sources, all of which represent the institutionalized translation of lessons learned from the radium era into protective practices that however imperfect and however incomplete, represent the best current effort to ensure that the knowledge purchased at such great cost by the people who encountered radium in its unregulated and misunderstood early decades does not need to be purchased again. The story of radium in the context of the nuclear age also includes the story of what happened to the radium industry itself, which had been built on the mining and processing of uranium ores, and which was transformed, and in some respects consumed, by the vastly larger industrial and governmental apparatus that nuclear weapons development and nuclear power required, beginning in the early 1940s when the Manhattan Project's demand for uranium ore created an unprecedented industrial mobilization that reached back to the same pitchblende mines in Joachimsthal and the Belgian Congo and the Colorado Plateau that had supplied the radium industry of the earlier period, and that processed the ore not for its radium content, but for its uranium, leaving behind the radium as a waste product in the tailings of uranium processing facilities, where it remained, still radioactive, still emitting, as it will continue to do for centuries. A legacy written in the geology of processing sites across the American West and Central Europe, that communities living near those sites continue to manage and monitor. The Belgian Congo, which had supplied uranium ore from the Shinkolobwe mine in Katanga province to the Manhattan Project, had also been one of the primary sources of radium ore for the pre-war radium industry. And the history of uranium and radium mining in what is now the Democratic Republic of Congo is a history that belongs to the broader story of colonial resource extraction, of the use of African labor and African land to supply the industrial and scientific needs of European and American enterprises without adequate regard for the health and welfare of the workers who did the mining or the communities that lived near the mines. And this dimension of the radium story, the colonial dimension, rarely appears in the histories of the Curies of discovery or the radium craze, but is present nonetheless in the material history of where the ore came from and who extracted it and under what conditions, and it is a dimension that the fuller telling of the story requires acknowledging, even briefly, even without the detail that it deserves, but that the present account does not have the space to provide in the depth it merits. The cleanup of legacy radium contamination in the United States has been an ongoing process, extending from the 1980s to the present day, involving the Environmental Protection Agency and state environmental agencies in the identification, assessment, and remediation of sites associated with the early radium industry, including the former factory sites in Orange and Ottawa, the residential properties contaminated by tailings used as landfill or building material, and the industrial sites associated with uranium and radium processing from the Manhattan Project era, and the costs of this cleanup have been substantial, running into hundreds of millions of dollars at individual sites, and the social disruption involved in identifying and addressing contamination in established residential and commercial neighborhoods has been considerable, requiring the excavation and removal of soil from properties that people have lived on and around for generations, a physical reckoning with a past that most of the current residents had no part in creating. The International Atomic Energy Agency, established in 1957 as part of the United Nations system, with a mandate to promote the peaceful uses of nuclear energy while ensuring that nuclear technology was not diverted to military purposes, has been involved since its founding in developing international standards for radiation safety and for the management of radioactive waste. And the standards it has developed and promoted reflect in their structure and their underlying assumptions about radiation risk. The accumulated scientific evidence that stretches back through the post-war studies of atomic bomb survivors and uranium miners to the foundational investigations of radium's effects on the dial painters and the radium water drinkers of the 1920s, a lineage of evidence that connects the international regulatory infrastructure of the nuclear age to the individual women who sat at tables in New Jersey and Illinois and painted the numbers on watch dials, whose names and whose suffering are the original data points from which so much of what we now know about radiation and human health was first derived. The question of how to store, manage, and eventually dispose of the high-level radioactive waste produced by nuclear power generation and weapons programs remains, in the early 21st century, one of the most technically challenging and politically contested problems in the field of environmental management and the solutions being developed. Deep geological repositories designed to isolate radioactive material from the biosphere for periods measured in hundreds of thousands of years represent the ultimate extension of the problem that began in Marie Curie's shed, the problem of what to do with substances that are useful and dangerous in equal measure, and that remain dangerous long after any human use for them has been exhausted. Substances whose persistence in the world is measured not in human lifetimes, but in geological time, and that require of the societies that have created them a kind of long-term responsibility that human institutions are not naturally designed to exercise. The rehabilitation of Marie Curie's reputation and legacy in the second half of the 20th century and into the 21st has been a gradual and ongoing process of scholarly and popular reassessment, recovering from the shadows cast by the scandals and controversies of her lifetime. The affair with physicist Paul Langevin in 1911 that had provoked a vicious press campaign against her at the very moment she was receiving her second Nobel Prize. The persistent resistance from certain quarters of the French scientific establishment to the full recognition of her contributions, the ways in which her nationality and her gender had complicated her institutional position throughout her career, and constructing in their place a more complete and more accurate account of what she had done and what it had cost her. An account that has become, in the contemporary period, one of the most widely told stories in the popular history of science, familiar to school children and general readers in dozens of countries and in dozens of languages, a story of perseverance and intellectual courage, and the willingness to pursue truth in the face of obstacles that would have defeated most people. The feminist dimensions of Curie's story, which were largely invisible to her contemporaries, and even to many of her biographers in the decades immediately following her death, have received increasing scholarly and popular attention since the 1980s, examining the specific conditions under which she did her science, the structural barriers she navigated, the ways in which her contributions were minimized or misattributed during her lifetime, and the contrast between the public celebration of her as an icon of feminine scientific achievement and the persistent institutional resistance to her as an actual woman doing actual science in actual institutions that were not, in many cases, designed or willing to accommodate her. And this examination has added a dimension of social and political history to the scientific biography that enriches the story considerably, and that places Curie's individual achievement within the broader context of the history of women in science, a history that is still being written, and that Curie's story both exemplifies and complicates. The physical objects associated with Marie Curie's scientific work have acquired, in the contemporary period, a kind of secular sanctity that is unusual in the histories of science. Her notebooks venerated as relics, even as they remain dangerously radioactive. Her laboratory in Paris preserved as a museum. Her image on stamps and currency, and public buildings in Poland and France, and many other countries. The Marie Curie Cancer Care Charity in the United Kingdom, founded in 1948 and named in her honor, one of the largest and most respected palliative care organizations in that country. All of these constitute a posthumous presence in the world that reflects the genuine and enduring significance of what she discovered and what she represented, while also carrying within it the inevitable simplifications and romanticizations that attend the transformation of a complex human being into a public symbol, the elevation of the scientist into the icon, the replacement of the specific, difficult, embodied life with the smooth and legible story that public commemoration prefers. Her daughter, Irene Joliot-Curie, who had followed her mother into physics and had shared in the Nobel Prize of 1935, died in March of 1956 of leukemia, as her own physicians noted, almost certainly related to her radiation exposures. Over the course of her scientific career, and the quiet, sorrowful symmetry of this, mother and daughter both given and both ultimately harmed by the same element and the same invisible force, is a fact that history has recorded without drama, in the plain language of medical cause of death, and that requires no embellishment and no interpretation. Only the simple acknowledgement that it happened and that it means something about the cost of certain kinds of knowledge, about the way that discovery sometimes claims from those who pursue it most closely a portion of the very life they bring to the pursuit. The contemporary understanding of radium's place in the history of science and medicine is one that holds both the achievement and the harm in view simultaneously, refusing the simplification that would reduce the story either to a triumph of scientific discovery or to a cautionary tale of corporate irresponsibility, because both of these things are true and neither is sufficient on its own to account for the full complexity of what happened. And the most honest account of the radium era is one that acknowledges the genuine brilliance of the Curie's work, the genuine medical value of radiation therapy as it was developed and refined, the genuine courage of the dial painters and their advocates, and the genuine harm inflicted by commercial exploitation and regulatory failure. Holding all of these things together in a single narrative that does not resolve into a simple moral, but that offers instead the more uncomfortable and more accurate lesson that human progress in science and medicine is rarely clean, that the path from discovery to benefit passes through regions of uncertainty and misapplication and harm, that the discoverers themselves rarely intended, and that the institutions of the day rarely prevent in time to matter. The history of radium also offers a specific and recurring lesson about the relationship between scientific enthusiasm and commercial exploitation, about the speed with which a genuine scientific finding can be extracted from its context of uncertainty and qualification, and transformed into a selling proposition stripped of the caveats and the methodological reservations, and the acknowledgement of what is not yet known, that legitimate science includes as a matter of intellectual honesty, and presented to a willing public as a certainty that it is not. And this lesson, which the radium era illustrates with unusual clarity, because the timeline is short enough and the documents abundant enough to make the process visible, is a lesson that the 20th and 21st centuries have had occasion to relearn in many different contexts, from dietary supplements to pharmaceutical drugs to environmental chemicals in each case. Following variations of the pattern that radium established, the enthusiasm of early findings, the commercial rush, the accumulation of evidence of harm, the long contested reckoning, the dial painters occupy a particularly honored place in the contemporary telling of this history because they represent, with unusual clarity and concreteness, the category of people who paid the price for knowledge they did not ask to acquire, who contributed to the scientific understanding of radiation's effects on the human body, not through any act of choice or informed consent, but through the simple fact of having worked in an industry that was harming them, before anyone with authority decided to act on the evidence that they were being harmed, and their story has entered the broader culture through Kate Moore's 2016 book, The Radium Girls, through theatrical adaptations performed in community theaters and school auditoriums across the United States, through documentary films and museum exhibitions, disseminated through a culture that finds in their story something that resonates beyond the specific history of the 1920s and speaks to continuing questions about the relationship between workers and employers and regulatory institutions and the evidence of harm. The radium that Marie Curie isolated in the Paris shed in 1902, the tiny fraction of a gram of radium chloride that she and Pierre obtained after processing 10 tons of pitchblende, is still in the world, in some form, its atoms decaying through their long chain of daughter products toward eventual stability, releasing their energy in packets of alpha and beta and gamma radiation at the rate determined by their half-lives, and the radium deposited in the bones of the dial painters who died in the 1920s and 1930s is in the soil of New Jersey and Illinois cemeteries, still decaying, still glowing at a level invisible to the naked eye, but detectable to instruments. And Eben Byers, in his lead-lined coffin in Pittsburgh, is still radiating. And the notebooks at the Bibliothèque Nationale are still warm, and the granite beneath the houses of millions of people around the world is still releasing its radon, and the hospitals are using the physics of radioactive decay to image tumors and guide surgery. And all of this is one story. The story that began with a photographic plate left in a drawer on an overcast February day in Paris in 1896. And that has not yet ended, because the physics does not end, and the consequences do not end. And the element continues on its long, slow, indifferent journey through time, caring nothing for what it has done or what it means, glowing softly in the dark as it always has. The social memory of the radium era, the way in which the events of the 1920s and 1930s have been remembered and transmitted and reinterpreted across the decades since, is itself a subject of historical interest. Because the process by which a set of events passes from lived experience through journalism and legal records and medical literature into popular history and cultural consciousness is not neutral and not automatic, but is shaped by the interests and assumptions and priorities of the people and institutions who do the remembering. And the radium story has been remembered differently at different times and in different contexts, emphasizing different aspects of its complexity, depending on what the moment seemed to require. In the immediate post-war period, the story of radium as a health tonic was largely eclipsed by the much larger and more urgent story of nuclear weapons and nuclear power, and the dial painters and the radium water drinkers receded into the background of the broader nuclear narrative, their specific experiences noted in the technical literature of radiation protection but not yet recovered into popular culture, in the form that Kate Moore's book and its adaptations would eventually give them. The environmental movement of the 1960s and 1970s, which brought renewed attention to industrial health hazards and their effects on working communities, created a cultural context in which the story of the dial painters became more legible and more resonant, connecting to contemporary concerns about corporate accountability and regulatory failure, and the health of workers in industries that use toxic materials. And historians of occupational health writing in this period began recovering the specific histories of the dial painting factories and the legal struggles of the women who had worked in them, placing them in the broader context of the history of industrial disease and workplace safety regulation that the environmental movement had made politically salient. The feminist scholarship of the 1970s and 1980s added another dimension to the recovery, noting that the dial painters were women, that their employers had been men, that the regulatory institutions that had failed to protect them were run by men, and that the history of occupational disease in female-dominated industries had received less attention and less institutional response than comparable hazards in male-dominated ones, a pattern of inequity that the radium case illustrated with particular force, and that connected to broader arguments about the gendered dimensions of industrial health risk and the protection, or lack of protection, that regulatory systems had historically offered to women workers. The popular cultural recovery of the Radium Girls story in the early 21st century, accelerated by Moore's book, and by a series of theatrical adaptations that brought the story to new and younger audiences, has placed the dial painters at the center of a narrative about corporate accountability and workers' rights that speaks directly to contemporary concerns about the relationship between profit and safety, about the willingness of employers to risk workers' health for economic advantage, and about the role of individual courage in confronting institutional power. And in this contemporary framing, the dial painters have become something larger than their individual historical circumstances, have become emblems of a recurring human situation that the 21st century recognizes as readily as the 20th. The situation of people whose suffering is documented and ignored, whose evidence is questioned and their credibility challenged, who must fight not merely for remedy, but for the acknowledgement that what was done to them was wrong, and who succeed, finally, in changing something, in leaving the world slightly more just than they found it, at a cost that was too high, and that should not have been required of them. The philosophical dimensions of the Radium story, considered at the distance of a century and a quarter, touch on questions that are not specific to radium or to radioactivity, but that recur across the history of science and technology, questions about the relationship between discovery and responsibility, between the pursuit of knowledge and the management of its consequences, between the optimism that drives scientific inquiry and the caution that the deployment of new knowledge in the world requires. Marie Curie did not discover radium in order to harm anyone, and the Radium Girls were not harmed by any failure of scientific understanding on Curie's part, and Eben Byers did not die because of anything that Pierre and Marie Curie did or intended. And yet, there is a connection between Curie's discovery and all of these outcomes that is real, even if it is not the connection of direct causation, but rather the connection of unintended consequence, of the way that a new thing introduced into the world by one set of people and one set of intentions passes through the hands of others who have different intentions and different knowledge and different vulnerabilities, and accumulates consequences that no single actor planned or could have fully foreseen. The philosopher Hans Jonas, writing in his 1979 work, The Imperative of Responsibility, argued that the expanded power of technology over the natural world required a new ethics based on the principle of responsibility, on the obligation to consider the long-term consequences of technological action, and to exercise a precautionary restraint in the deployment of technologies whose effects were not yet fully understood. And the radium era, which he did not specifically discuss, but which illustrates his argument with almost uncomfortable precision, might be considered a case study in the cost of the absence of such an ethics of what happens when the deployment of a new technology runs far ahead of the understanding of its consequences and the institutional capacity to manage the risks it creates. The concept of the precautionary principle in environmental and public health regulation, which holds that when an action or policy raises threats of harm to human health or the environment, precautionary measures should be taken, even if some cause and effect relationships are not fully established scientifically, has deep roots in the regulatory history of the post-war period, and draws, among other sources, on the experience of the radium era and comparable industrial health disasters in establishing the case for erring on the side of caution when the evidence of potential harm is present, but not yet conclusive. A principle that has itself been contested and debated in subsequent decades as regulators have grappled with the question of how much uncertainty justifies how much precaution and who bears the burden of proof when the evidence is ambiguous. The radium era's contribution to these ongoing philosophical and regulatory debates is the contribution of a particularly clear and well-documented example, in which the gap between the accumulation of evidence and the taking of protective action is visible and measurable, in which the decision makers who failed to act more quickly left records that allow their reasoning, such as it was, to be examined, and in which the human cost of the delay is documented in the medical records and the legal proceedings and the newspaper accounts of women who were dying while institutions deliberated. A cost that gives the abstract debates about precaution and regulation a weight and a specificity that purely theoretical discussion cannot provide, and that makes the argument for earlier and more decisive action in the face of uncertain but suggestive evidence of harm not an abstract philosophical position, but a conclusion grounded in the specific history of specific people who suffered specific consequences while the relevant institutions moved at their own pace toward a requiem too late to help the people who had most needed it. The museums and archives that now hold the artifacts of the radium era carry within their collections a particular kind of material history, one in which the objects themselves are not merely symbolic but physically active, still emitting the radiation that makes them simultaneously historical evidence and potential hazards, requiring the same kind of care and caution in their handling that their original owners were never given. And this quality of the objects, their continuing radioactivity, their refusal to be simply inert historical artifacts, is a fitting emblem of the radium story as a whole, which refuses, similarly, to be simply historical, continuing to be present in the world through its regulatory legacy, its medical applications, its environmental contamination, and its ongoing relevance to debates about industrial safety, corporate accountability, and the management of radiation risk. The Smithsonian Institution holds a collection of radium-era consumer products, including bottles of Radithor and tins of radioactive cosmetics that are stored in lead-lined cases and periodically measured to confirm the level of radioactivity they still emit. And the National Museum of Health and Medicine in Silver Spring, Maryland, holds medical and scientific artifacts associated with the radium era, including items from the dial painting investigations. And the Curie Museum in Paris, housed in Marie Curie's former laboratory on the Rue Pierre et Marie Curie, preserves the physical space in which the Curies worked, though the furniture and equipment have been decontaminated to the extent possible, and the laboratory itself is described by the museum as not entirely free of contamination, a description that is both technically accurate and inadvertently poetic. Because the space in which radium was first isolated and studied retains, in its very walls and floors and surfaces, a trace of the element that was discovered there, as if the place itself remembers what happened in it, keeps the memory of it not in some sentimental metaphorical sense, but in the physical reality of atoms lodged in the plaster and the wood, atoms that have been there for more than a century, and that will be there for centuries more. The display of radium-era artifacts in museums raises questions about how to present this history to contemporary visitors in ways that are accurate and complete, and that convey both the genuine scientific achievement and the genuine harm, without reducing either to a simple moral lesson. And the best museum presentations of this history tend to be those that hold the complexity, that show the laboratory and the factory and the courtroom and the hospital and the advertisement and the medical report in proximity to one another, that resist the temptation to organize the story as a simple narrative of progress from ignorance to knowledge, and that invite visitors to sit with the discomfort of a history that contains within it both wonder and tragedy in proportions that cannot be cleanly separated, because the wonder and the tragedy came from the same source and were products of the same discovery, and the honest telling of the story requires keeping both in view at the same time, in the way that the element itself kept its beauty and its danger together, glowing softly and indifferently in the darkness, asking nothing and offering everything, and taking, in the end, whatever the physics required. And so we arrive at the end of this long, quiet journey through the history of radium, a journey that has taken us from the overcast skies of Paris in February 1896, when Henri Becquerel placed his uranium salts in a drawer and waited for the sun, through the cold shed on the Rue Lomond, where Marie and Pierre Curie processed ton after ton of black ore in search of something they could feel but not yet see, through the luminous watch-dial factories of New Jersey and Illinois, where young women worked in the quiet concentration of skilled labor, through the drawing rooms and golf clubs, where Eben Byers drank his small glass bottles of certified radium water, through the courtrooms where Grace Fryer and Catherine Wolfe Donahue and their companions fought for the acknowledgement of what had been done to them, through the museum cases and the lead-lined archival boxes and the Superfund cleanup sites and the hospital radiation therapy suites and the residential radon testing programs that constitute the continuing presence of the radium era in the contemporary world. And having travelled so far and through so much, we come to rest here in the present moment, which is your moment, the moment in which you are reading or hearing these words. Perhaps in the quiet of a room at night, perhaps in the soft edge of consciousness, where waking and sleep become indistinguishable. And it is worth noting, gently, that you are here, that the past we have been visiting together is safely distant, that the radium glows only in museums and in the bones of people who have been in the earth for nearly a century, that the knowledge purchased at such cost has been imperfectly, but genuinely, translated into protections that you benefit from without needing to think about them, the safety standards and the regulatory frameworks, and the occupational health laws that stand between the world you inhabit and the world that the dial painters inhabited, and that this distance, this safety, is itself a kind of legacy, the most important kind, purchased at the highest possible price and maintained, as all such things must be maintained, by the ongoing attention of people who remember why it matters. The element continues its long, slow decay in the darkness of the earth, its half-life measured in 16 centuries, its glow invisible to the naked eye, but present, always present, in the physics of the world that Marie Curie helped us understand. And her notebooks still rest in their lead-lined boxes at the Bibliothèque Nationale de France, still warm, still radiating, as patient and as persistent as the knowledge they contain, waiting for the next researcher who will sign the waiver and put on the protective gloves and open them, carefully in the knowledge of what they hold, which is not merely the record of a scientific discovery, but the record of a life given entirely to the pursuit of understanding and of an element that gave back everything it was asked and kept, always, its own counsel, glowing softly through the centuries, indifferent to what it has cost and what it has given, asking nothing from the darkness but to be seen. Let your breath slow now, and let the history settle around you like the dust of centuries. And let your body grow heavy and still, and let the past drift away on the current of your breathing, the Paris laboratories and the Illinois courtrooms and the New Jersey factories, all fading gently into the comfortable distance of things that happened long ago. And here you are, safe in the present, in the quiet of wherever you are resting, and the night is long, and the story is done, and you may sleep now, slowly and without urgency, as the radium glows on in the dark, patient and indifferent, counting its centuries in the silence of the earth.